wanting to understand what the brain is, it's really important that we consider anything that has really valid data into our theory. We can't throw out data just because it doesn't fit our theory. We really need to look at that data and see what does that tell us. And it's in that information that doesn't fit in with the paradigm that science advances itself. As a neuropsychiatrist, I knew about cases of people called autistic savants. And that's where I've been focusing my research, is on savants. And my interest in autism really began back when I was in high school. And a friend of mine gave me a book about a boy. He wasn't given a diagnosis of autism at the time, but he really had all of the hallmark symptoms of it. He was not socializing with people. He was playing by himself. He wasn't speaking with people. And he really was living in his own little world. And that's actually where autism comes from. It comes from autos, which is self. And this little boy was in therapy with a woman named Virginia Axline, and in her work with him, she enabled him to come out of this shell that he was in, and she discovered that he was a really very bright child and very advanced. And I was inspired by that and was wondering if there were other children like him, and indeed there are, and they've increased in numbers such that I've been able to work with them. And savant syndrome is found more commonly in people with autism than it is in any other condition. Approximately 10% of autistic individuals can have a savant skill. And many of these skills are can be accounted for by just an incredible memory.
It's neurological. It is, you are or you're not. But I did come to see that as very much like a spectrum within a spectrum. The human species, every single one of us is unique.
There is maybe this tension between really pushing the nature of heterogeneity and individuality, and at the same time grouping people together and saying, right, you're autistic, okay? And I think, well, actually, there doesn't necessarily need to be that tension if at the conceptual level one understands levels. So I think, okay, on one level, we are all inhabitants of the world, and we share the world with dolphins and sloths and killer whales. So we are all under the same umbrella. Hang on though, am I a killer whale? No. Am I a sloth? Well, it depends on who you talk to. But I think I could distinguish myself by saying I am a human being, and I would classify under this set of criteria, which is perfectly valid, that this is a fish. In the same way that I am a man of a certain age, that sets me aside from a man of a different age, or a woman of the same age, and so on and so forth. And as you bring those layers down, at some point, I think there is an absolutely natural and appropriate classification of this brain is an autistic brain. This brain is not. And I think that's actually very, very useful in terms of individuals understanding themselves, because if one regards autism as a minority group, which statistically it is, you look at the research and people like Tony Atwood saying, oh, if you want a cure for autism, take your person with autism and put them somewhere safe and leave them on their own and close the door. Have they got any problems? No. There aren't any communication problems because there's nobody there to communicate with. Are there any social problems? No, because the person's on their own. Are there executive functioning problems? No, the person's quite happy playing on their PlayStation or their Xbox. Is autism a problem? No. So therefore, it's a cure, in inverted commas, setting up an environment, an employment environment, which is I'm guessing very autism friendly, all of a sudden those problems disappear. You've got the same brain, you are still autistic, but you've gone from one environment where there are huge numbers of problems to all of a sudden this might even work to your advantage.
I just think I've always been in the wrong environment. It was something I thought that would make a nice t-shirt, and again it was after sort of thinking about some of the things that you'd said about autism itself is not a disease. And it's like, yeah, totally agree. I'm actually relatively happy with me. But put me in the wrong environment, it'll kill me. I'm not that attached to life at the best of times. But whatever you do, don't try and make things worse than they are. And I think that in that sort of respect, now I feel very much like, well, now I've been sort of diagnosed autistic, and it's not me, it's the environment, stupid. You know, have that as a t-shirt.
You would take a neurotypical child and send them to an autistic mainstream school and expect them to survive. They wouldn't survive, just wouldn't. Or saying to neurotypical people, go and work in an environment where everybody's autistic and you've never even heard of autism before, but you're expected just to get on. You'd find that very, very difficult. And it's exactly what is happening on a day-to-day basis with people with autism. They're forced into those sorts of situations.
Sometimes it's confronting to be faced with having to make difficult decisions around what is okay and what is best for our children and for us and our families. But in remaining compliant with those systems that misunderstand autistic people or don't accept the reality of our experience, we're not creating change. We're not making life easier for our children. We're not helping them to be successful or functional in the future. We are reinforcing oppression. We are reinforcing a system that is failing them. So speaking up, even when we think people won't listen, speaking up and standing in our truth is my response to what we should do in those circumstances, because this is the real world. I hear parents say all the time, but in the real world, people won't accept that. And that's the responsibility of those people. It's not my child's responsibility to make adults comfortable. It's not my child's responsibility, my autistic child who is disabled, it's not their responsibility to reinforce a comfortable, complicit, conformist society that they don't get to have a space in, to show up in the world in their organic, natural, authentic, autistic self. That's not what I want for my children. That's not what I want for myself. That's not what I want for anybody who struggles in society. Using our voice to advocate for anybody that needs advocacy, not just autistic people, but coming from a space where we understand what it's like to be misunderstood, to be made out as though we are unintelligent or incapable, or that we don't deserve accommodations to be made, or that we are inadequate in any way, shape or form. When we have that lived experience, when we understand what that's like, then we have a responsibility to extend our compassion and our empathy and our privilege across all minorities, across all spaces where people need to be advocated for.
This whole concept of inappropriateness, and it's inappropriate to use the term inappropriate, and I do actually think there's something to be said about that, because it is very much a judgment decision just based on neurotypical concepts. So essentially a bunch of neurotypical people applying neurotypical concepts onto people who aren't neurotypical. Well, surely there's a flaw in that, because you're applying it onto a population who aren't neurotypical. So the whole development of that level of appropriateness is only appropriate to neurotypical people. Autistic behaviour, invariably, I don't know. You can't qualify that statement because I don't know everybody with autism. But everybody that I've met, all autistic behaviour that I've come across, makes perfect logical sense from the autistic perspective. And that isn't often the case for the neurotypical population. And I think it should, or could, anyway, change the whole conceptual understanding of autism, amongst the whole of the population. In that if you accept that behaviour, anybody's behaviour, is based on logical parameters, okay, quantifiable or otherwise, an individual will behave in a way that is logical to them. Now, those logical parameters don't exist when you're born, okay? They are developed, either neurologically developed in terms of development, literally just development, what you learn in an indirect way, but also by your experiences. Now, most neurotypical people have influence by the society in which they live, and those influences are of a similar nature for one person to the next. So the logical parameters of the neurotypical population is going to hugely overlap with one another because they have grown up in the same society, they have the same sorts of influence, they have different upbringing, but similar sorts of values that are inferred and so on and so forth. The autistic person is far less likely to be influenced by those sorts of parameters, less likely, if at all. So what happens, but everybody's got to have their own set of logical parameters. So the individual with autism, their logical parameters are based solely, I would say almost solely anyway, on their own individual experience. And as no two people can have exactly the same experience, that's why people with autism are actually more individual than their neurotypical counterparts. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, and actually their behaviour always makes perfect sense if you've got an understanding not of autism, but of that person with autism in that circumstance at that particular time, with an understanding of everything that's gone on up until that point, and what's going to influence that individual's behaviour. Now, if that's the case, we can completely get rid of the whole concept of impairment or disorder or whatever, or those sorts of barriers. And if we teach that as a curriculum subject, that all human beings, their behaviour is based on this, then the whole discriminatory process against, well, I don't really like your behaviour, it's a bit odd, will go out the window. Because if it's instilled as a conceptual understanding of human behaviour, then there'd be a far greater acceptance of behaviours that aren't neurotypical. That's the ideal anyway. The issue, I think, is that there's so much that's indirectly learned and processed by neurotypical people, that actually the recognition that autistic people have to work that out for themselves, or have to consciously understand what's going on an ongoing basis, is absolutely exhausting, and can lead to the appearance of disability when actually the individual's not disabled at all. So, issues to consider: autism is not inherently problematic. Being autistic is not a problem, full stop. The problem comes when those individuals are juxtaposed within environments with people who don't understand their autism and therefore react in a manner that isn't conducive to the development of the individual themselves. And the reality is that people with autism do face many problems in society. So if you look at that as the equation, autism plus society equals a problem, and you also recognise the fact that you can't change somebody's autism, then it makes perfect logical sense. If you're going to change the equation, the end point of the equation, that we're going to reduce problems for people with autism in society, then it's society that needs to change, not the person with autism.
One thing that I see parents or professionals say often in response to autistic people sharing their experience. So we might say, okay, so a meltdown is the result of ongoing stress, or a meltdown is the result of being overwhelmed by sensory input. A meltdown is the result of long-term chronic anxiety. It could be the result of anything. And there are different kinds of meltdowns and different reasons for meltdowns. Now, often in response to that, there'll be a couple of people who might say, well, that's all well and good, but in the real world or in school, people don't understand that. And my child is misunderstood. So how do we teach them to fit into a world that isn't going to understand them? Which I understand because I've been there as a parent myself, and I've had the same worries. And my response to that is, when you are in a position of privilege And what I mean by that is, if you are a white person and if you are able-bodied and if you are not autistic, or if you are in a position of privilege, then we have a responsibility to do all that we can to change that narrative. So, with the understanding that my child may be misunderstood in society, with the understanding that my child may have a meltdown at school and their educators may believe that they're just being naughty or being destructive, I feel a sense of responsibility to my autistic community there in that space to educate those people. Now, people will only be educated if they want to be. People will only learn what they're ready to hear and learn and take on. And that's their responsibility. And I can only give the information I have, and that's that.
Those things that is flawed. And I will quite happily challenge the academic, not the academic validity of studies that demonstrate a lack of theory of mind, but the presentation of the data in that what it's inferring is not actually necessarily the complete picture. Or way back in Francesca Happe's day and Uta Frith and then Simon Brown, kind of sort of three key components around the theory of mind. The tests, if you like, horrible term, but the studies that were undertaken were basically a bunch of autistic people here. This is in a nutshell. Right, a bunch of autistic people, tell us what this bunch of non-autistic people are thinking and why they're behaving. Strangely enough, they don't know. Okay, you failed your theory of mind test, you're rubbish. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's basically what they're saying. Now, what I think is, hang on a minute, well, you're not just talking a theory of mind, you're talking cross-neurological theory of mind. You're talking about theory of mind for differing neurotypes, by definition, differing neurotypes. Where are the tests on the predominant neurotype, who were just average people off the street? These are just average autistic people off the street. Go out there, get 100 average people off the street, show them a video of a bunch of autistic people and say, why are they behaving like that? They will fail those theory of mind tasks. Guaranteed. Of course they will. So if we're going to say autistic people lack a theory of mind, it's equally got to be accepted that neurotypical people lack a theory of mind. The reality is, if you take it a step further, what we're actually saying is there's a lack of cross-neurological theory of mind, not theory of mind in itself. There's plenty of autistic people who demonstrate a fantastically good theory of mind for other autistic people. A number of people that I come across, and we're there discussing autistic behaviour, and so often the person with autism will say, well, that's obvious. Of course it's obvious. Why are you so stupid? Why don't you understand it? Don't you know? That clearly demonstrates a very effective autistic theory of mind within neurotype. So I think it's very unfair to say, okay, well, you are impaired because you lack a theory of mind. Actually, you're impaired because you actually live in a world. The impairment, the disabling effects of that lack of cross-neurological theory of mind is because most other people think in a different way. It's useful and effective. This whole thing about people with autism being impaired in non-verbal communication. Interestingly, by the way, this whole myth about autistic individuals who don't present non-verbal communication is complete garbage. The vast majority of people with autism will use non-verbal communication. It's the interpretation of neurotypical non-verbal communication that's problematic, generally. Most autistic people will have all sorts of expressive non-verbal communication skills. But the whole concept that it's actually beneficial is bizarre, because actually it isn't. It isn't clear for anybody. People know about this. In all of the books about, not all of them necessarily, but a lot of the books about autism, how you are with this whole thing about being very clear, very concise, very precise, and so on, which is great. My issue is, how many people actually do that in reality, in their everyday lives, when they're with somebody with autism? How often do those individuals think about what they're going to say before they say it, to ensure that it won't be misinterpreted, that what they're saying is actually linguistically accurate? And very often you find that intellectually people understand that this is what they should be doing. The reality is that they're not doing it. Most neurotypical people talk to other neurotypical people who are equally linguistically lazy, and therefore they seem to understand one another perfectly well. The problem then comes when you've got somebody who's very linguistically accurate, who essentially is talking a different language. And yet it's the person who is more linguistically accurate that gets told they're disordered, gets told they're impaired. I just think, well, hang on, that's not fair. How the fact that so many people working in the field of autism have got it completely wrong, and how much it irritates me. But really what it is just about, I suppose conceptually the most basic thing is trying to encourage people to think. I'm absolutely convinced that one of the key differences between autistic people and the predominant neurotype is the autistic ability to think past what's in front of their eyes. And I think that's quite a common characteristic that you rarely find in the neurotypical population. And that drives me mad. I think it works very well within neurotypical communities because people think in the same sort of boring ways. But when there's that sort of juxtaposition between the autistic community and the neurotypical community, those sorts of inferences and intuitions don't seem to stand up to scrutiny. And I think a lot of that is down to the fact that neurotypical people just don't seem to think to any level of depth. They don't have that ability to think through what it is that's presented in front of them. Even some of the most basic so-called factual information that you find at conferences, on the internet, people training relating to autism, don't stand up to scrutiny. They're not valid statements of fact. And I think as a result of this, the whole of the medical community is actually based upon quite flawed thinking or lack of thinking. And the end result of that is major problems for people with autism and their families. So it's the same in everyday practice you see in schools and services and therapeutic approaches and so on and so forth. I'm very much of the opinion that when you're with somebody with autism, you have to think, that you don't get away with not thinking. And you can't think in your boring neurotypical way. You have to think in an autistic way. You have to. Otherwise, there's going to be major problems. And I think, actually, the detrimental effects on people with autism as a result of neurotypical people not adapting their own thought processes, cognitive processes, communication, and so on and so forth.
Intelligence is often assumed to be congruent with that type of autistic expression. So people often assume that somebody who is labelled as severely autistic or low functioning automatically has an intellectual disability as well. And that is extremely inaccurate. And this is the first thing that's really important to know about autism. It is a different way of showing up in the world. We can be 100% completely parallel in terms of our intellect and our intelligence as a non-autistic person on the inside, but our physical expression may lead others to believe otherwise.
When it starts to get bad, I can feel it getting worse, feel more anxious, feel a lot of tension in my body, can feel a little unwell, sick, nauseous, very panicky, mixture of stress and very high anxiety. Feel trying to do anything is all too much, can't relax, want to get up and move but feel trapped. I can't do that. When I try and move, then it is that bad. I feel I shouldn't have done it, or done it in the wrong way.
Also wants continuity and predictability, and if it's not as anticipated, they hit the panic button. They wake up in the morning with a clear plan, this is what we're going to do. When there's a change, they have no idea how to reconfigure the plan for the day. They can't visualize it, they don't know what to do, they hit the panic button. Now, for me, insisting on sameness and routines and ritualized patterns is actually a sign of anxiety. And I think this is a behavioral mechanism of imposing routines and needing rituals that are soothing and calming.
The problem is not people with autism. The problem is everybody else's lack of understanding of those individuals and then the ability to make necessary adaptations. But I'm not dismissing the myriad of very real problems associated with autism. So, myth number one, autism is a spectrum. Autism is not a spectrum. Autism is a population of people, for a start. When it was first introduced, the concept of the spectrum, when Lorna Wing introduced the concept of the spectrum, I think she did it absolutely correctly. She was talking about the diversity of the population, diversity of the manifestations or the presentation of people with autism and so on. And I think that's absolutely spot on. I think the heterogeneity of the population is without question is not an homogenous group. And I've got this hypothesis actually, it's almost sort of Orwellian where, you know, sort of all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. I think everybody, all people are individuals, but actually people with autism are more individual than the neurotypical population. And I think actually that there's a justifiable rationale for that. Concept that at one end you've got severe autism, and then at the other end you've got Asperger's syndrome. That's horrific. In a sense that I genuinely don't understand how it's possible to grade autism. It actually isn't possible. What is possible is to grade an individual's level of behaviour, grade frequency, duration of behaviour, all of those things that we've known about for donkey's years. What's not possible is to understand neurologically what's going on behind the scenes. And I think what actually this does is incredibly discredit and patronise individuals with autism who are able to present in a manner that the clinicians make the assumption is we can only be very mildly affected. You've got absolutely no idea what's going on behind the scenes. Absolutely no idea.
This kind of falls into place, our understanding of what autistic expression is or what autism is really isn't helped by the notion of a spectrum. And whilst the description of a spectrum is well-intentioned, and I guess the drive for that was for people to understand that so many variations of human being identify with being autistic. So many people visualize a spectrum as a linear representation, like a line with low functioning starting down at the beginning point and high functioning being up the other end. Now let's talk about what's in between. What is in between? Because I never hear people talking about what's in between those two extremes.
If you'd have taken a video of that individual in that studio in what was actually a very comfortable environment for her, engaging in what was very comfortable for her, which is questions and answers, very structured, intellectually very able to do, and very stimulating for her, her presentation of autism was essentially nil. In the afternoon, the presentation of autism was extreme. She's exactly the same person. Exactly the same person. She's not suddenly more autistic. Her grade of autism hasn't suddenly increased after lunch. Has exactly the same neurology. And I think you can see, I see that frequently in individuals that I work with. Individuals who have a diagnosis of very mild Asperger's syndrome, who, as Mark was saying, are committing suicide. You don't commit suicide if you're mildly autistic. That's completely insane. It's all about the presentation of the individual. And I think actually a lot of individuals with autism are very good echopraxic, copying individuals who are very intellectually able, so they've worked out how to put on this facade. I know all sorts of individuals who have different personalities depending on which situation they're in, and they will choose which person to become because they've got to. None of it is themselves. They've got to be somebody else because they know that they're going to get abused or isolated or whatever if they don't. You know, I know individuals who have different names for themselves when they go to work. They've got to talk about remote controlling themselves because they have to put on this front. Those are individuals who struggle to get a diagnosis. Those are individuals who, even if they do get a diagnosis, the assumption is because you're walking and talking, you're articulate, intelligent, you can't be very autistic. It's completely insane.
Which is a really decent reason why we should understand that a spectrum is not a linear representation. It is more like an array of colour where we take bits and pieces from the spectrum of colours to make up the autistic person. And we take those variations from communication and interests and our sensory profiles, which also change across time because we're on our own developmental timeline. So then when we move away from what people describe as low functioning or severely autistic, we slide all the way up that imaginary scale to high functioning, which typically is somebody who presents like me. And people whilst they completely undermine a non-speaking person's capacity and ability and intelligence, they completely overlook or dismiss the disability aspect that a person like me experiences as part of my autistic expression. Now, just because you can't see on the outside the same things that you would see in my autistic siblings who are more obviously autistic, doesn't mean that I don't have many of the same challenges or variations of those. For me, most of my autistic experience is internalized, so I experience it on the inside, and I have learnt to be a master of masking, which means changing my expression, my behaviour, how I look on the outside in order to fit into society, to go untargeted, to not be detected as different, because we learn very early on that that's not safe for many of us. That's not safe for many of us. Whether that be in a school system around bullying or in a workplace.
His teachers never saw the extreme anxiety and manifestations of breakdown which he showed at home. In adulthood, he shows the same extreme patterns. He has the worst episodes of catatonia and related difficulties at home. When he is outdoors, either with his family or with other people, including professionals assessing him, he is able to mask, overcome his difficulties, and is fluid in his movements, speech and thought processes.
I went to her workplace trying to explain how incredibly stressed this individual was, and they all sat there and said, we haven't noticed anything. Okay, well, we accept what you're saying. What is it that's stressing you out? And she just gave an example of being in a group meeting, which is one thing. It doesn't stress her out, it terrifies her. It takes weeks of her life stressing about when it's going to happen, and weeks afterwards stressing about the fact that it has happened, going through it, usual sorts of things, although she hides it very, very well. And her line manager said, oh, well, I get a bit stressed in group meetings as well, so, you're not on your own there. And she meant it, it was very well meaning, but for this individual to be told that, I was probably being inappropriate. I said, look, that's analogous to saying to somebody, oh, you've just come back from the hospital, and I know you're terminally ill with a brain tumour, but I get headaches sometimes. It is a parallel. There is a parallel to be made there, and I think it's extraordinarily patronising to individuals to say, well, we're all a bit like that, because you're not. You're either autistic or you're not. Where do you find autism in terms of the diagnostic criteria? International Classification of Diseases, it's not a disease, and in a publication by the American Psychiatric Association, it's not a psychiatric illness. Even at that very, very, very basic level, for years, society's got it wrong. Completely wrong. And I think there's the year in, year out of thinking that is based on this kind of house of cards that is not substantiated is hugely problematic for the population. Hugely problematic. Okay? I'm not saying that there is nobody with autism who might be considered to be impaired in communication or whatever, but this is a different way of thinking, and it's a very valid way of thinking. I would say that because it's my way of thinking, but I genuinely believe there's a high level of validity behind this thinking. The concept of the triad of impairments is basically based on statistics of populations. Basically what it's based on. The majority of people do things in this way, people with autism do it in a different way, and immediately that was termed impaired. That's basically what happens. And I just think conceptually, that's extraordinarily unfair. And reality, actually, if you scrutinise the reality, it's actually inaccurate anyway.
Understanding the narrative of stigma and the illusion of choice.
And so, it's important to understand that autism is a disability. But our understanding of disability in reference to autistic people is something else to have a closer look at. So under the neurodiversity model, we have what we call the social model of disability. Now, most people, when they hear the word disabled or disability, they understand that a person has a difference in their body or a difference in their mind or their brain or some aspect of their being that prevents them from being able to function as an able-bodied neurotypical person. When we talk about disability, that's called the medical model of disability. So the responsibility of disability is given to the person who experiences disability or has a disability or a difference. When we look at the social model of disability, we come to understand that a person's abilities and disability is impacted by how well they are or are not accommodated socially by society, in a classroom, in a workplace, in their home environment, when they go out to a shopping centre. So an example of that in autism is that when I'm at home and I'm in my place of comfort and I'm doing the things that I do and I know my processes and I have my schedule or whatever I have as tools, I'm not stressed. I'm not anxious. I would say that I'm not experiencing disability. When I go out to a supermarket, there are many stimuli that impact on my sensory sensitivities. So bright lights, loud sounds, lots of people around, which means that I have to process a lot of information through all of my systems all of the time. And that can be stressful for an autistic person. So in that environment and in that moment, I am experiencing disability. Now, if there were accommodations made, lower lighting, less sound, less people, I may not be experiencing disability to the extent that I would when accommodations are not made.
There are plenty of things that a person with autism is going to find extraordinarily difficult compared to their neurotypical peers. It doesn't mean to say, and there are certain things that individuals will find impossible, but just being autistic doesn't preclude you from anything at all. Absolutely nothing. Having additional problems, comorbidity and learning disabilities and so on, that throws a spanner in the works to a certain degree as well. But being autistic itself doesn't preclude you from doing anything at all. By the way, the flip side of that is just because a person with autism can do something doesn't mean that they should be forced to do it. The whole thing in mainstream is called, well, we know he can do assembly. Why is it so important to do assembly? But, we know he can do assembly because he did it last week. It's like, yes, he collapsed for 3 days afterwards, but he did do assembly. And because he did assembly last week, he can do it again now. And I always say, well, that person in a wheelchair could get up the stairs if they really wanted to. They could drag themselves up. But if there was a fire, they'd soon get out of their wheelchair and drag themselves up. Just because they can doesn't mean they should. And again, it might appear perhaps a bit of an over-the-top analogy. It's not over-the-top analogy at all. The neurological distress caused to people with autism for forcing them in situations that they find extraordinarily difficult, though not necessarily visible to the neurotypical population, is enormous. Absolutely enormous. The exhaustion of having to be somebody that you're not, or to figure things out the whole time, is absolutely shattering for some individuals, neurologically, intellectually, emotionally. Absolutely shattering. And often we don't see that. We don't see the repercussions of those because people with autism have learned they've been told, you can't be this, you can't be this, you can't be this. So they've learned to hide who they actually are. And the concepts you've got to be social, you've got to do things. Another thing that really drives me bonkers is the whole thing about teamwork. Well, it's really good to work as a team. And I think, well, what if you don't work well as a team? Then logically it doesn't work very well. That's right. And I can appreciate that it serves a purpose for them. But it doesn't serve a purpose for me. So actually trying to force those two entities together actually logically is not a productive way of working. Look, I am very, very effective working on my own. My capacity for work is almost infinitely higher than if you put me with somebody else. There's no point. I didn't want to work well as a team because I won't. And she found it so difficult to understand. You just think, well, what's the problem with that? Logically, there's nothing to say. Well, actually, having two people working in isolation, an output of 100% is better than sticking them together working at 75%. It's crystal clear. Just because most neurotypical people like being in a team does not necessarily make it productive.
We're saying to a person in the medical model of disability, well, you're the person with only one leg, so we trust that you'll work out. you'll work that out. You'll work out how to adapt and show up in the world. But when we look at a social model of disability, we would say, oh, we see you've only got one leg, or we see you have one leg. How can we support you? How can we make this process today easier for you? Can you give us information so that we can accommodate you, so that this isn't as difficult, so that you can have the same experience, or as close as possible to the same experience as people with both legs. Now this is called equity, different from equality. And this is confused all of the time, particularly in schools. So I want to give you a personal example of this. As a university student, I contacted somebody in the Faculty of Psychological Sciences, of which I'm studying, and I said, I asked for an extension. Can I have an extension that is longer than 3 days beyond the due date, please? Because I need to give my brain processing time. I process information much slower than other people. Doesn't mean I do it in a way that's not adequate. Just means I like to get my head around things. I like to pull things apart, make sense of them, put them back together in a way that works for me, and then get on with the job. I have a whole process around how to do assignments. And this professional responded to me by saying, well, that wouldn't be fair, because typical people or non-autistic people only get a 3-day extension. And if we give you more than a 3-day extension, you are getting an advantage. Issue around telling me I have an advantage is that I have a disability. I am autistic. So whilst I appear to look the same as a person who is non-autistic, whilst I can still learn and I may still be able to produce the same results on an assignment as my non-autistic peers, my path to getting there is significantly different. My process to produce the same results and the same quality of work is significantly different. So supporting me in that process to allow me as an autistic person to have the same opportunities and the same process, or as close as possible the same process as my non-autistic peers, is called equity. It doesn't mean I have an advantage. It means that I'm having accommodations made so that I can produce the same outcome. And this is a mistake that's made often inside of educational systems. So whilst we might think that an autistic person has an advantage by having extra time to produce academic work, oh, trust me, it's not an advantage at all. It is not an advantage.